You ever wondered why in today's cars, trucks, or whatever, that if any one small thing happens, the car wants to shut off? Or let's say you can't get it to start, or it won't even, in the old days where cars wouldn't do anything, it's probably because it's your ignition switch or you have a bad battery. That's why it's not starting. Um, Well, today's cars have this thing called an ASD. Um, this is widely used in, I want to say, every vehicle with the, how do I explain this? It's not a security system. It's not like your skim key for your fob. It's not one of those. The ASD is an internal relay, sometimes external, depending on who makes the vehicle. But the ASD pretty much stands for an automatic shut-off device. Depending on the manufacturer, it functions as a, I guess you could say it's a bridge. For instance, for my RAM, the ASD will only activate if your skim, which is going to be your key, basically, in short, anything that revolves around the engine operating needs to talk to each other in order for the ASD or the automatic shut-off device to actually release. Well, to enable, to send power to, well, not power, but to be able to send commands to whatever it needs to. Or like a latching relay. Well, things that when I'm talking about is like your transmission control module, your engine control module, your skim key, which is your security immobilizer, your if you have a keyless system or a fly-by-wire system for your ignition switch, you have a RFH receiver and your body control module. Those five things, no matter what is wrong with the car, have to communicate. In some vehicles, the instrument cluster and the radio as well. But essentially, those five things, if you have a fly-by-wire system like most new cars are actually going to, where you have your RF module that controls your key fob, where you unlock and lock your doors, remote start. And in some cases, your RFH receiver also holds the data for your tire monitor. You also have to have your body control module. Your body control module nowadays sends power to every single thing on the vehicle. So if that doesn't have the handshake with the ASD module or the ASD relay, it's not going to do anything. Then you have your transmission control module. Well, your car can't start if it doesn't know if it's in park, and your park system, especially with new transmissions, even with manual transmissions, where you actually have a true manual, when you're in neutral, usually there's a neutral switch in the transmission to some degrees if it has a module for it to let the engine computer know that it's in neutral or not in a gear. And without that handshake, it not knowing that it's in neutral or if it's in park, if it's an automatic, it won't release its ASD relay inside of it. Then you have your engine computer. It's got an ASD relay internal of it. Well, if for any reason that it finds something wrong with it won't give a handshake and a release its ASD relay, which goes in turn to, in my case, all the way to my TIPM, which has an ASD relay in it and enables and then turns on all of the other things. There's different ways that manufacturers implement this ASD protocol. For instance, in some vehicle manufacturers, if your skim key is invalid in any one of the modules, just one, your vehicle will start, run, and die. or in some vehicles, your car won't even turn over. Or in some cases, if it's implemented that way, your immobilizer will turn and your car will just sit there and just go ding, 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 ding. It'll just turn over. It won't do anything. Well, the way Mopar does their ASD relay with their talking is it allows you to try to start the vehicle. If it detects anything wrong when it's trying to start the vehicle, it then goes into a ASD fault command, which basically turns it basically, it's true and false. It sends itself from a false state to a true state, and it locks you out of being able to start the car. Well, start the engine. Now, this is not to be confused with invalid skim. It's not to be confused with having a bad key fob or having a bad RFH module. In those cases, you have to have either the key fob replaced, or you have to have the RFH module replaced, or you have to have a new key programmed. Now, the difference in a true lockout and an invalid skim is the fact that if you walk up to your vehicle and you can't lock and unlock your vehicle, all right, that means that your skim key or your fob key has lost commands or lost handshakes with your RFH receiver. Now, in essence, your RFH receiver needs to be able to talk to the key, and the key has to be able to talk through the ignition, your wireless ignition, which I don't really think it actually works that way, but that's what's got it in the wiring diagram. I don't really think that's how it's going to work. But I do know the ignition module is controlled directly through the TCM. And I know this by if the TCM thinks it's in a gear, it'll lock you out of being able to take the key out of the ignition. But your RFH hub then needs to communicate with the body control module. Your body control module also has to have that skim programmed in it. Now, once you stick your key in the ignition, the RFH module sees that there's a key in ignition, and it determines if it's a valid skim. When you turn it to the on position, all right, now the RFH module now has to communicate with the body control module, and now they have to handshake to see, all right, is this the right, are we seeing the right key? Is our skim the same? All right, they have a handshake. Now, when you go to start the engine, there's two things that that very, very, very misunderstood. Just because you have a valid skim key and you turn your ignition on does not mean the vehicle will start. For instance, in my case, because I have a lot of modules replaced, my skim key is valid in every module because they're from the same vehicle except my ECM. That means that all of my components are handshaking except that module that controls the engine. The transmission and everything are all handshaking, but the ECM is not. So the ECM shows invalid skim. But if you look into the ECM live data, it clearly shows that it sees the ignition switch, it sees that it's in the on position, and it sees it going into the start position. But what does it have? It has an invalid ECU skim, not an invalid skim, an invalid ECU skim. So it means the skim key code that it sees inside of itself does not match what it has, which means that it will not start the engine, it will not control the starter, it will not control anything else in the vehicle that involves the ECM or the engine controlling. However, that is the only module that has an issue with issue with the skim. So that means all of my doors, radio, instrument cluster, everything else functions in the truck except I can't start the truck because inside the ECM it's set an ASD fault to true and allowing me not to be able to start the vehicle. Now, if the same issue was happening in the transmission, it would tell me that I would not be able to shift out of drive, which I don't understand why it would tell me that if I'm already in park. But it'll say I I can't shift out of drive. I can't shift out of drive, even though I'm in park. But it doesn't matter anyway, because if I can't start the vehicle, the latch won't release and it won't go out of gear anyway. But that is a common misconception of what an ASD is. Now there's different ASDs. You have an auto shutoff ASD for accessories, and you have an auto shutoff device for what I'm talking about, which is not security. In no way, shape, form, or fashion does this involve security. This is only for handshaking between different modules to determine if they can start, not as security. For instance, like I said, you can have an invalid, well, actually, no. Your security, the reason I said it's not security is if it was a security issue, you wouldn't even get that far. Especially with Mopar, if you have an invalid skim key, when you stick it in the ignition, you get nothing. You can't even read the odometer. That's in some cases. In most cases, you can't even turn it to the accessory position and get anything out of it. But I know in my case, that's what happens. If I stick an invalid key into it, all it says is wrong skim key, and that's it. That's all I get. That's a security lockout. Now, if with the correct key in, the ASD comes into play, and if something doesn't have the correct criteria, and the reason it's an ASD issue, not a security issue as a skim, because anything can cause the ASD to trip. And what I mean by that is mismatched VIN, which is not a security issue. Vehicles can start and run for ages with a mismatched VIN. In my case, the steering wheel control module is not hooked up because I have to get a new one. The transmission sees that, because without the transmission seeing that, it can't tell the traction control system what to do. So the traction control system will not release the ASD inside of it. The ABS will not release its ASD because it also sees the steering wheel control module. It doesn't see it. It's not a security issue. It's a handshake issue. It just so happens that in my case, because I replaced that module with a non-original module, it doesn't have that code in it to handshake. So that is the really big misconception of what an ASD is. ASD is not a security issue. It's not a security device. It's only a handshake device. It's not the primary reason, but it's the most responsible reason why your car will shut off, or you will not be able to start your vehicle, or something won't work on your car because of a bad module. And most people that see this are people that actually inherit a damaged module and their vehicle dies. In some cases, the vehicle won't even die. For instance, if your transmission control module's ASD, depending on who makes the car, obviously, if it goes, sometimes it won't even shut the car off. For instance, in the Rams, if your ASD latch disengages because of an issue with the transmission, the way it's supposed to work is it's supposed to hold drive and not let you shift out of it until the car comes to a stop. And then when it comes to a stop and you switch it to the park, you can't take it out of it until the problem is fixed. That's the way it's supposed to work. But there have been some cases where there's been an issue with the transmission and the ASD will shut down the truck because it lost that signal. And that's the way the ASD works on the Ram. Even if there's a problem with the module, it needs to see that module to be able to latch the system. So that's a real big misconception. It's a real in-depth thing to go into. but that's just a general understanding. I was asked about that today. Um, on their scan tool, they saw it was ASD Relay um, internal fault failure. Now, because it's an internal fault failure, in 9 times out of 10, that module needs to be replaced. Fortunately, that fault will only show up in that module. Now, you may see in another module where it says it can't communicate with the module that has the fault, but usually only the module that has the ASD fault in it has that. And that's a really rare code to get. Usually you'll get a lost communication code off of it, but I was asked that today, and he was confused with it because he didn't know what it did. There was no way to actually explain how it actually worked. He went to the dealership. The dealership only thing the dealership could tell them is that he needs the ASD for the vehicle to run, and he was trying to get keys programmed to the vehicle, and it wouldn't program. And I had to sit there and explain to him it wasn't the key that had an issue. It was a module that was in the vehicle that was malfunctioning, not the actual key. So he got that module replaced, got that module programmed. The vehicle's running now. But that's what an ASD is. Well, that is what that type of ASD is. The other ASD involves with say like your headlights when you get out of the car and you push the park button and they flicker and they stay on for a certain amount of time. That's a different ASD. But that's the type of ASD I'm talking about. I had a friend that literally did not know what it was. His scan tool only told him what it was, what module it was in, but it didn't give a good enough description. The dealership didn't give him a good enough description, so I think he spent like maybe an additional $300 trying to get that going than what he needed, because he couldn't get anyone to explain to him what an ASD was. But hope this helps anybody that has an issue of that kind, and maybe they'll be able to look further into their issue than pointing directly at your skim key. Peace.